In this video, we're going to focus on what happens in the background when you buy Bitcoin. So, what happens in the actual network when a Bitcoin transaction goes through? This is not meant to be a technical breakdown. We're not going to get too much into the technology, but it's very important to understand how this network works just so you feel more informed about making decisions in this space. A lot of folks, when they're buying tokens, coins, cryptocurrencies, they tend to think about physical coins, physical currencies, and physical tokens, not understanding that this is a very different way to transact things. The way that information is traveled in a blockchain is very similar to how information travels on the internet, more so than how transactions occur outside of the internet. And so when you guys start to understand that, hey, when I buy Bitcoin on one of these exchanges, Coinbase, whatever it is, what actually happens? Where does this money go? And how do I get a Bitcoin? How does it just show up in my account? So I just want to walk you guys through the very basic steps on what happens in the background. And we're going to try to go through this as simply as possible. Now, understand that there are more complicated steps to this process. We are only going to cover the superficial layer, just the most basic stuff that we can, just so everyone feels a little bit more informed going forward. So let's get started. When you go to buy Bitcoin, the first thing that you do is you're going to request a transaction. So you might go to an exchange, you might go on a Coinbase, the Coinbase exchange, and you might request to buy some Bitcoin. The second step is that your transaction request is sent to a network of computers called nodes, and nodes are distributed amongst a lot of people all around the world. So there's not one central place where all these computers are. It's different people around the world who are operating these special computers. These transactions get sent to those computers for something called validation. Now, the validation process is basically these nodes or these computers checking to see if the transaction that you're sending is valid. Some individuals will try to double spend a Bitcoin. So they might try to spend a Bitcoin they've already spent somewhere else. If you try to do any of these kind of fraudulent activities in the network, the nodes will reject your transaction. This is how the network is kept safe. It's basically this network of computers around the world that can basically validate these transactions using math equations. And once they validate it, then you can get approved and move on with the process. So you request the transaction. The transaction is sent to that network of computers. The network of nodes validates the transaction, and the transaction is called a block, right? So it's going to validate that block. And we've talked about blockchains previously, but this is going to be just a layer on top to help understand how this actually moves around in a transaction. Once that block is approved, then the nodes, they broadcast that transaction to the rest of the network, to the rest of the computers out there that says, hey, I validate this transaction. Once everyone has validated the transaction, it gets broadcasted and then added to the blockchain. So let's imagine that this last block right here contains your transaction information. So this block gets sent to all the nodes. Those computers will basically validate the transaction to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing fraudulent about it. There's nothing that you're trying to do that's nefarious. Once it's validated, it gets broadcasted out to everybody else. Everybody approves that, and then it gets added to the network. Now, this block is added to a chain of different blocks that have different transaction informations, and that's what creates a block chain. It's a chain of all the different blocks. And we talked about this in the previous video about what a block is. You guys know that a block is it just contains pieces of information and transaction data that allows the network to know that this is your money and it's going to your account. And so when they're chained together, it creates a ledger. And you can say, hey, block number 5 right here came after block number 4 and came after block number 3. So we're just going to go ahead and do a quick recap. You go on Coinbase and you request a transaction. That transaction is broadcasted out to the nodes. The network of nodes validates your block. The block is then broadcasted out to the rest of the network. And then once it's approved, the block is added to the chain and now it's part of the blockchain. So that's how transactions are validated in the background. You don't have to become a technical expert on this, but I feel like it's very important for everyone to understand how this works in the background. So when you're actually doing these transactions, you have a more informed opinion and you can actually make better decisions along the way. So I hope that you found this helpful. If you have any more questions about the details and the technicalities, please make sure to reach out to a coach and they'll be happy to help you.